problems. I am, or was, not a JavaScript developer, not a hardcore JavaScript developer at least. I have no idea how to make a browser library like that. I know how to play with jQuery and how to write backend JavaScript code, but how to make something that installs like that, I wasn't too familiar with. And then how to maintain state. There's a lot of libraries out there for you to maintain state and update the UI. And the most important thing is I didn't want to go crazy while I was doing that, right? There is so much JavaScript out there, and it's really hard to kind of get a grip as to what exactly you should be doing. So, what this talk is about today is I'm going to take you through some actual JavaScript. I'm going to take you through some actual code today. So for those of you who are not developers, just ask the developer next to you what the hell is going on. They will explain. I'm going to talk a bit about JavaScript, a bit about bundling, a bit about kind of state management libraries, UI management libraries. I'm going to do some occasional cat pictures in between. Nobody? That was disappointing. Okay. Well, so let's talk about bundling. There's a couple of options out there. Bundling basically is where you take all your JavaScript files and you kind of mend them together into a certain way in which you can reuse them all into one little package rather than loading them independently. Loading independently is really nice in the back end when you have a full node environment, but when you want to do it in the front end, that's not always what you want to do. So the options are browser, I never know how to pronounce this, browserify. Horrible name first of all, but it's quite old. It's kind of only just JavaScript. It doesn't really understand ES6 imports and exports on its own, and it doesn't really result in any very small files. Much newer is this thing called Webpack. So Webpack is it's really only just kind of about the last year. It's much newer. It can do a whole bunch of different things like handling kind of JavaScript and images and CSS files and a whole bunch of other things. Still doesn't quite understand ES6 imports and exports on its own. And again, it's not always returning the smallest result. It's also not very simple. Like if you compare it to some of the other libraries, because it can do so much, the configuration of it can get very complicated. What I want to talk to you about today is Rollup. Now Rollup, I've been playing with, and Rollup is very cool. So Rollup is really new. It does only JavaScript, that's the downside. Still doesn't quite understand the import and export of ES6 modules on its own, but it does something really cool called tree shaking. And it's simple to use. So let's quickly look at Rollup and why it is so cool. Now the cool thing is, like, when I combine it with Babel, I can just write ES6. ES6 is kind of the new version of JavaScript. It's been around, kind of been specified in the last few years. It all bundles it into one file, so you just specify one entry point, and it just bundles it in one file. And it's much smaller than browserify and Webpack. And it does some cool stuff like exporting to all of these kind of standards. Now I'll show you in a moment what that looks like, because to a lot of you that might not mean anything at all. And tree shaking. So tree shaking, let's look at ES6. So this is some typical kind of JavaScript under ES6. You can write classes, and you can write very nice little functions. Sure, you don't need to define a function anymore. And here at the bottom it says like just export awesome source. So it just exports what that module exposes to the external world. You can then use that, right? So I have some awesome source, and I can import that from my awesome source module, and then I can just call a method on that source object. Now, you might be working in enterprise though, so you might have an enterprise source, right? Which is not 100 lines of code, it's 2,000 lines of code, because it's more secure, right? That's how you make things more secure, more lines of code. And what you're doing is you're exporting two versions. So you export by default, you export awesome source, but you give people the option to import, the enterprise source for extra security. And that's 2,000 lines of code. Now, the problem is that if I can use that like that. I can use that like that, and it imports 2,000 lines of code. Now, to give you a better example, this is an actual example. So this is two files. One of them imports cube from mass.js. And as you can see, mass.js has two functions defined in here. There's a square and a cube. but we're only importing the cube in our outer file. Now, what Rollup does is it kind of deletes, when it combines stuff together, it deletes that function. It deletes that square function. It automatically strips that away because you're never using it. So if you're using an enterprise awesome source, yeah, and you include that into your file, you include the whole 2,000 lines of code. But if you don't include it, it just, when it bundles, it strips that all away. You end up with a very small JavaScript file, only with the bits of JavaScript that you're actually using. Now the other cool thing is it does UMD. Now UMD is, it kind of wraps the same stuff in kind of this really complicated block of JavaScript. And what that does is that allows me to do this thing, on the earlier slide where I can just say, and use that object in the browser in a global scope. I'll come to that in a second. That's what the compiling looks like. You just say rollup, and you pass it a configuration file. For me, I just run this in NPM. Then in my rollup distribution file, my config file, I just specify an entry, a destination, the UMD, what I want to call it. In this case, I call it punch. I do some uglifying and some other stuff. And this is what it, for example, looks like for me. For me, I've kind of combined a whole bunch of different libraries together. And down there is the punch setup, and that's actually the bit that I've used before. So, now what gets trickier is UI management. So actually making sure that you can combine your UI, update your UI, not just buying lots of click handlers everywhere and making stuff work. So you end up with amazing spaghetti code. Now, somebody very wise said that there's nothing that can be said that's certain but death and taxes. And I think the other one is probably JavaScript frameworks. There are so many of them out there at the moment, React, Angular, etc. And it's kind of madness how many there are. It's really hard to get a good overview of them. But I'm still going to try and do that. And the way I'm going to do that is very simple. For me, the most important thing is I want to end up with a small library. Now, Angular, to include Angular into any library, you end up with about 50 KB compressed. That's quite a lot, just bring into any project. React, Facebook's, Pride, 146 KB compressed. That's a lot of stuff. Now, I was looking around, I was trying to find something that can do something a little bit like React, but without, adding 146K to my library. And I found this thing called Riot. Now, Riot is really cool, but the most important thing is compressed. It's 9.18 KB. Now, that is a lot closer to what I actually wanted, so I went with that. So what is Riot? It's a library much like React. It allows you to do custom tags, a virtual DOM, an enjoyable syntax that doesn't make you go nuts. It doesn't support IE8, because if somebody enjoys using IE8, they have different problems in their life. And like I said, it's really, really, really tiny. So this is what it looks like. So you just specify, like somewhere in your div, in your HTML, you specify an element, and then in your JavaScript, you just include a tag. You import Riot, and you says, hey, mount this tag to that element, which is pretty much exactly what I wanted. And the tag just looks something like that. Just a hello world, just a custom tag with its own namespace. So in this case, punch drop-in. I just have my own HTML in there. And the cool thing is you can even nest these, so you can have multiple files with templates in it, and you can just kind of load multiple ones nested inside of each other, which is really good for kind of separating concerns into its own little namespaces. So we're starting to see the end of the tunnel here. It's kind of getting there. The only thing that we're missing still is statement. We need to update the UI, right? We need to update it, we need to add stuff to it, remove it, depending on what the user does. Now, there's two hard things in computer science, caching validation and naming things, but I want to add to that, which is state management. Oh, I forgot that's supposed to be three hard things. Oh no, I forgot. Crap. Like, this is hard. State management is hard. making sure that you're always updating every UI element based on something that somebody has done and every other thing that they have done before can be really hard. Now luckily, out of the React kind of world came a very little library, and I'm not going to run you through another 10 libraries because that was very unnecessary. I said there would be calculators, right? Calm down, calm down. The small one that came out of React is Redux, and it totally fits the bill. It's 2 KD, it's really small. I'm really happy with that, and that's including all of its dependencies, which is really nice. And that's even before you compress it. So there is a Riot plugin. It looks something like this. This is the same sample I had before. I just instantiate a store, a create store method. I pass it a state in there, and then I mix that into my Riot environment, and now I'm able to use my state inside of Riot. Then in my file, I can do something like this, and actually tie things together, and actually add a state in, and for example, build out a counter, and then I can listen to events coming in and change them. I'm going to speed it up a bit because this is taking up, my time is going away faster than I thought. Let's just skip to a demo. So here on stage, what we have here is, this is the entire kind of sample. So in here, it just says counter.setup, and that's just because I've compiled it as a UMD module. I say tie this to a container, and it ties it to this little container here. My counter just looks like this. In here, it has the counter, and it prints out the state. I have two buttons, a plus and a minus, to increment and decrement the counter. I mix in Redux, I listen to the state, and then I have here two things where it dispatches new events based on what happens in these on-click handlers here at the top. My index file, it includes Riot, Redux, and the Redux mix-in. It has a reducer. The reducer basically says, hey, here's a state and here's an action. It applies the right action on it, and then it returns the state. And then here at the bottom is just the setup code for actually binding it to my element. And then here's my roll-up code just for like rolling it up. A lot of this is just plugins, the majority, and then in and out. And what that looks like is very simple. Like I said, like if you look at the source, it's just those lines of code. And I've got a perfect little counter here that I can just increment and decrement. Oh my God, this is like the most exciting thing we've seen today. Counter. But given that there's nothing like explicitly updating a counter element, it is really exciting. Now, what is even more exciting is how big that is. Because, let me show you. That is a total of 12K zip, the entire thing. And I've been working on this a bit longer now. There's some other people that have conducted comparisons between all the different libraries. If you look at kind of Babel, Browserify, Uglify, like for a certain sample test project, they came to about 3.9K. Webpack 2, Babel, Uglify, etc., 3.6K. Rollup, 3.4, as you can see. The only ways to kind of get smaller file sizes is by using stuff like TypeScript, just because it's kind of statically analyzed. Webpack 2, Babel, Uglify, etc., 3.6K. Rollup, 3.4, as you can see. The only ways to kind of get smaller file sizes is by using stuff like TypeScript, just because it's kind of statically analyzed, or something like Clojure. But I wanted to stick with JavaScript. I wanted to just write JavaScript and nothing else. So for me, Babel, Rollup, and Uglify was kind of the right combination. You can find more of that there. My results, the source was about 37K, but that's a bit unfair because that doesn't include all the dependencies. Once it was bundled, it came to about 180K, then Uglified, and gzipped. So I gave it about just under 20K. Now, if you compare this to like Stripe's library, if you import that, it's about 200K. Braintree is about 200K. So this is about a tenth the size and has a lot of the similar functionality to do almost the same thing as a form. So for me, that's really handy, especially if you're on mobile. Like just every kilobyte that you need to load in is just an extra kilobyte that you have to wait for. So we're getting there. This is really cool. This is really cool. My conclusions are, most of these are personal opinions, is that ES6 is lovely. Writing JavaScript in ES6 is lovely. I'm not by trade a JavaScript dev originally, but writing ES6 I've actually started to enjoy it. Riot is really easy to use. And using Riot with Redux makes it really easy to comprehend what you're doing. I also think that using NPM instead of grunt and gulp makes things a lot easier as well. The notes to kind of add to that is that Rollup and Riot, at the moment it breaks source maps, so kind of debugging what's going on can be a bit of a pain. There's a really cool new thing in Webpack, which is chunks, where you can load your JavaScript on demand when you get around to it. It's more useful for kind of complicated apps where you might start up somewhere and you don't need all this functionality yet until the user does something specific, and then you load in those files. I've not played with that yet, but I have played with my my little counter demo with Webpack, and again, it came out much more. I also haven't done really any routing, and a lot of this is not very scientific. It's a lot of it's hard to compare these sizes scientifically without actually, a lot of this is very, very anecdotal. That's it from me. At the bottom, you'll find 2 links. You'll find these slides, and you'll find the demo. I also made a version of the demo that uses Webpack, if you want to compare it, and compare how it's just in a different branch on GitHub. Have a look at that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Cristiano. It seems that you're also competing for the prize of finishing early, so still have a minute left.
Yes.
So while Andy, our next speaker, is setting up,
yes.
So I still want to ask you one thing that's potentially relevant for the audience here, since there's a lot of developers in the audience.
Yes.
So you went from working for a big company to basically doing your own gig in freelancing.
Yeah.
So how did it go, and what did you advise the guys? Are you too expensive? We can't afford you. It's okay.
No, you can.
Okay, let's talk about that offstage. But would you advise people to make that step, because you've done this transition from like big company to doing your own thing? So is that something that you would like advise in general, or how was that experience for you?
For me, this is not the first time I'm doing contracting. I've done this before. I think for most people, like, make sure you're in the right place all the time. Have a look around you. Are you learning new things from your colleagues and from your surroundings? If you're not, go and find a different place to work. And that applies to big companies, small companies, etc. Find good teams you can learn from, teams that will teach you new stuff.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you very much for the advice, Cristiano. I appreciate it.